Greetings and welcome back, fellow gamers. Video gaming has been around for several decades now. I've personally been around for over 40 years of it, me personally starting back with Atari 2600. But video games and home video game consoles have been around a long time before even that. But if there's anything that tens of millions of modern gamers will tell you, it's that one juggernaut stands out above the rest as contributing the most to our industry.
Experience the icon. The original PlayStation.
As of this recording, there have been 5 generations of PlayStation so far, and every single one of them has dominated their respective generations. PlayStation gives us the industry standard controller loved by over 100 million gamers around the world, and these countless millions of PlayStation fans will no doubt be able to tell you all kinds of wonderful things that PlayStation has brought to the industry. Sony's genius and brilliant foresight brought us disc gaming instead of cartridge gaming. Analog control and force feedback, motion control, online gaming, hard drives in every console, transition from 2D to 3D gaming, even trophies. But despite all of their successes, how much credit does Sony really deserve for all this? Let's begin with their controller. After all, it is the industry standard after which many others are modeled. Surely this must be because it's the best, right? And of course, we owe Sony lots of gratitude for all the wonderful features that they have. Well, how much of those features can we even attribute to Sony? To answer that, we may have to look all the way back to the beginning. The earliest controllers bared little to no resemblance to what we use today. It's not just that they were boxy, but any buttons or joysticks or whatever input mechanisms that they used were either completely different or at least laid out completely different. I would say that the Genesis, the earliest ancestor of the modern controller, is the Famicom/Nintendo Entertainment System. While they were still primitive and boxy by today's standards, it's the first time that we had the D-pad for controlling our character on the left, A and B buttons on the right, and a couple menu-type buttons or functional buttons in the middle. After that, some other consoles followed Nintendo's lead, mainly Sega. But then the next development towards what we have now came from Nintendo again, this time from the Super Famicom/Super Nintendo. There were 2 major developments here that stuck through to today. One of them was going from 2 to 4 buttons on the right-hand side, going from A and B to A, B, X, and Y. But in addition to that was their arrangement, almost like a D-pad on the right-hand side, almost like an up, down, left, and right, except it's A, B, X, and Y. That button configuration has been pretty standard all the way to today. The other noteworthy addition was the new shoulder buttons, in this case L and R. Now if you take a Super Nintendo controller and randomly rename the buttons to arbitrary shapes instead of letters, slap a couple grips on there, you basically have the original PlayStation controller. Now that shouldn't be very surprising if you bear in mind the history of the PlayStation, how it came to be in the first place. What I imagine many don't know is that the PlayStation was originally a partnership with Nintendo. But I'm sure we'll revisit that later. Now you say, okay, but at least Sony added the little grips. Well, right around that time, the controllers were kind of migrating in that direction anyways. The Sega Genesis already had a somewhat semi-boomerang shaped controller. And around the launch of the original PlayStation, there was the Bandai Apple Pippin, which had a very boomerang shaped controller. And the Nintendo Virtual Boy had long grips on its controller. While the Nintendo 64 didn't come out till a little bit later, its controller had grips way early into development when it was still the Nintendo Ultra 64. Alright, well those earlier controllers didn't have analog control sticks, but when we went from 2D gaming to 3D gaming, we needed a more modern way of controlling our games, so we went to analog control, and surely Sony gets credit for that. Well, no. While we were transitioning from 2D gaming to 3D gaming, Sony did not have the foresight to go to a 3D means of controlling our characters. The original PlayStation controller did not have analog control sticks. It only had a D-pad like the Super Nintendo. Nintendo 64 launched in 1996 with analog control on day one. It wasn't until 1997, a year later, that Sony finally offered the dual analog controller. Clearly, this was in response to seeing how much better it worked for Nintendo 64 games. It's actually a bit of a surprise that Sony waited until 1997 to offer analog control, considering that we knew about Nintendo 64's analog control long before it ever released in 1996. Sony clearly just went all that time figuring it wasn't really necessary and just stuck with the D-pad. They did the same thing with force feedback. Now, Nintendo 64 didn't launch with Rumble, but they did add it later with the Rumble Pack, and at first everybody shrugged it off, made fun of it as just a stupid gimmick. But eventually over time, Sony realized, hey, Nintendo's onto something, so they rehashed their controller again, giving us the third iteration of the PlayStation 1 controller, the DualShock. So, twice in a row with that same console generation, Sony updated their controller design, not based on their own innovations, but following Nintendo's innovations. The abominable piece of crap Sony controllers haven't even been the most logical or ergonomical. Now, credit where due, over 5 generations, they have got a little bit better, but it shouldn't have needed 5 generations to figure out that their controller is going to be held by human hands and not some kind of robots or aliens. They have a long history of stubby grips that weren't long enough or comfortable contoured to human hands. They've had convex triggers, which is just plain stupid. And after 5 generations, they still have you reaching to the bottom middle of the controller for the left analog stick. I've always heavily favored and loved the Xbox controllers. Maybe not as much the giant unwieldy one for the original Xbox, but definitely from Xbox 360 to present. They just feel fantastic in my hands, almost like Microsoft gave me some kind of memory foam and had me hold it and then base the controller on whatever shape it formed. It's also great that I don't have to reach awkwardly for the left analog stick. The triggers are shaped like actual triggers, and the buttons aren't squirrel, giraffe, dodecahedron. So the PlayStation controllers definitely aren't pervasive because they're so innovative, and it's definitely not because of ergonomics and wonderful practical, logical configuration. It's purely because hundreds of millions of people use their controllers. Interestingly, one of the most popular controllers comes from a game console that didn't have nearly the sales that it should have or deserved. The GameCube released almost 25 years ago in 2001, and yet almost 25 years later, its controller is still one of the most popular with fans. For one thing, they love the ergonomics of it, the feel of it, and it's a lightweight controller. But Nintendo had a lot of thought that went into the exact configuration, the layout of the buttons and everything. They weren't content with just slapping the buttons on there and calling it a day. They figured that there was one button that we'd use more than any other. We'll make that the A button and make it front and center. Then off to the side from that, we had the B button, which is similar but smaller. And then the X and Y buttons will radiate also out from that, but they'll have their own distinctive shapes as well. And it's easy to slide the thumb out and hit those while also holding the A button. It also had very distinctive left and right triggers. And while they were analog, just like most other triggers, it has a unique feature that once you pull it beyond a certain point, there's a distinctive and satisfying click, at which point it's treated more like a button than a trigger. This allows for the analog portion of the pull to be treated one way, and the button click at the end to be treated another way. Well, what about 6-axis motion controls introduced for PlayStation 4? Surely Sony at least gets credit for innovating that. Well, once again, I'm going to deny Sony that credit. That was Sony's response to Nintendo's Wii Motion Control. Now, admittedly, I can't give Wii credit for inventing motion control, but it was Wii's motion control that prompted Sony to add it to their controller. But it should also be noted that Nintendo did dabble with motion control all the way back on the NES and Famicom. So to sum up all this controller business, at no point has Sony yet created the best controller, and there isn't really anything about modern controllers for which we can give Sony praise. All they've really done is go through following in everybody else's footsteps, gathering up what everybody else has done, and cramming it all into their controllers. Okay, so I'm denying them credit for anything regarding the controllers, but there's no denying the overwhelming popularity and success of the PlayStation 1 all the way to this date. So surely they must have been doing something right, and with the Nintendo and Sega already established with the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, surely there must have been some kind of major game changer that Sony brought to the table. Super Nintendo was a huge success, having sold over 49 million units worldwide, and Sega Genesis wasn't too far behind with a little under 31 million worldwide. However, the Sony PlayStation came along and sold more than both of these combined, selling about 102.5 million units worldwide. So what was it that the Sony PlayStation brought to the table that the other guys didn't offer? Was it the improved hardware performance? Looking back at them, one obvious difference was the CD drive, whereas the earlier consoles used cartridges. Or maybe it was the shift from 2D gaming to 3D gaming. Perhaps as gamers were growing up, Sony brought more mature, adult-oriented content to the table. Well, let's start with the improved hardware. Prior to the PlayStation 1, the dominant consoles on the market were the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, but these were neither Nintendo's nor Sega's first game consoles. Both of them had already replaced older hardware with newer, more powerful hardware before, and were absolutely definitely going to do it again. And history records that they did do exactly that. But even before bringing out a new console generation, Nintendo already had a long-established history of improving the capabilities of their hardware. On both the original Nintendo Entertainment System and Super Nintendo, Nintendo snuck chips into the cartridges to increase the capabilities of the consoles beyond what they could normally do. Nintendo rarely advertised this, but one famous example that they did make a big deal of was the Super FX microchip on the Super Nintendo cartridges. On both the NES and Super Nintendo, if you flip the console over and look at the bottom, you may discover hidden ports that Nintendo built in, leaving themselves options for future updates, upgrades, expansions, whatnot. Sega had released the Sega CD and the 32X to improve the capabilities of the Sega Genesis, and both Nintendo and Sega went on to release the Nintendo 64 and Sega Saturn respectively. So Sony coming along and offering a new generation of console with increased capabilities wasn't remarkable. Surely the big glaring obvious answer here is the CD drive. Now cartridges did have their advantages over CDs. We never really encountered load times until we got to games on CDs, and we've already established that Nintendo could use cartridges to sneak little processing chips on there, making the hardware more capable than it originally was. Additionally, cartridges allowed us to have game saves directly on the cartridge instead of needing a hard drive or some other storage medium. The huge game-changing advantage of CDs, though, over cartridges was the dramatically increased storage space. The absolute largest Super Nintendo cartridge ever officially released was only 6 megabytes. PlayStation CDs, on the other hand, came along offering storage up to 660 megabytes. That's a whopping 110 times the size of the largest Super Nintendo cartridges available up to that point. If that 660 megabytes wasn't enough for you, just simply add a second CD. Or why stop there, add a third or a fourth. Now maybe it's not entirely fair to compare it to Super Nintendo. The direct competitor for the PlayStation was Nintendo 64, which did offer bigger cartridges. Even so, the largest N64 cartridge was 64 megabytes and only 2 games had a cartridge of that size. The limitation with cartridges was the prohibitive expense of them. PlayStation CD offered you 660 megabytes of space for just pennies. Even the smallest capacity cartridges cost several dollars, and the more that you increased the capacity, the more that cost went up. This difference in capacity ended up being the critical bit, as the emergence of the CD format coincided with an increase in the demands from video games. Now we were suddenly wanting a bunch of voice acting and CD quality audio, and to cram a bunch of full motion video sequences in there. And all these things needed far more space than what you could ever have put on a cartridge of old. So this was the game changer. This is what propelled Sony to lofty new heights beyond anything Nintendo had ever reached before. Surely we can at least give Sony credit for this foresight and genius. Well, not so fast. Even disregarding developments on the PC front, Sega had already moved on to CDs with the Sega CD add-on for the Sega Genesis, and the PlayStation didn't come about because of Sony, but rather because of Nintendo. Sony was a hardware manufacturer and already made the sound chip for the Super Nintendo, so it wasn't an illogical stretch to have Sony then make the CD add-on for the Super Nintendo. That ill-fated partnership wasn't ended by Sony, but rather by a public, humiliating, Games of Thrones-y betrayal by Nintendo. Sony then took the work that they'd been doing with Nintendo and made it its own standalone game console, the PlayStation. Although it should be noted that the partnership with Nintendo is also going to be called the PlayStation. Alright, so thus far this hasn't really gone PlayStation's way very well. Surely there's got to be somewhere in here that Sony can rack up some points. So what about the shift from 2D gaming to 3D gaming? That transition seemed to coincide with the PlayStation. Once again, keeping with our trend, I'm going to have to deny them that. That's something that we had already been working on in one form or another for quite some time, but we were kind of pretty much waiting on the technology to catch up with what our ambitions were. Note here that's 1993 and Super Nintendo. Let's not forget that the original PlayStation 1 controller didn't even have analog sticks and relied entirely on all the same things that we had for the Super Nintendo controller before it. So maybe it was a shift from more kid-friendly gaming towards more adult-oriented gaming. Well, was there really that much of a shift? I mean, was there really? Okay, yes, Nintendo was famously stubborn about the adult graphic content. Perhaps the number one top most famous example of this is the original Mortal Kombat. In arcades, it was known for its blood and graphic gore and violence. But on Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, the blood was taken out and replaced with sweat or spit or something. However, the Sega Genesis version did have a cheat code that could put the blood back in, whereas on the Super Nintendo there was no such thing. But they learned their lesson quickly, and from Mortal Kombat 2 onward, they kept the blood in from day one. But did the original PlayStation really come along and raise the bar for graphic mature content? For answers, let's look at the original early PlayStation 1 games. So let's see, we got Ridge Racer, a racing game, not particularly graphic or violent or gory or adult. Then there's Battle Arena Toshinden, which is a fighting game, but we already had plenty of fighting games long before this. Looks like we got Air Combat, a flying game. There's Rayman, a colorful, cartoony side-scroller right at home on any of the Nintendo platforms. There's the Raiden Project, a vertical scrolling shooter. I see Street Fighter the movie, and we already had several Street Fighter games long before PlayStation. There's NBA Jam Tournament Edition, a basketball game. I'm just not really seeing the game changers here. The undeniable fact of the matter is the PlayStation came along and was a smash hit. It was a monumental success, and I'm not denying them that. What I am saying is that it's not that Sony done anything remarkable or brilliant. They didn't come along and offer a remarkable new way of playing gaming. They didn't single-handedly change gaming as we know it. They didn't really offer anything the other guys couldn't compete with. It was just kind of dumb luck that they happened to be at the right place at the right time. The original PlayStation was up against the Nintendo 64, and the Nintendo 64 was a 64-bit console versus the PlayStation being 32, and the Nintendo 64 was just simply overwhelmingly superior hardware in pretty much every measurable, conceivable way. But after failed dealings with Sony and with Philips, Nintendo stuck with cartridges at a time where we suddenly started needing a lot more storage than what a cartridge could feasibly, realistically, affordably offer. This meant hit franchises like Final Fantasy, which had always been on Nintendo hardware, had jumped ship and went to Sony. And I think at the bottom line, it's ultimately the games that sell hardware. Then we had Sega, which also offered their own alternative CD-based platform. But unfortunately for the Sega Saturn, Sony was an electronics juggernaut, offering the PlayStation for $299 versus Sega Saturn's $399. Even now in 2026, a $399 price tag wouldn't be taken lightly. But we're talking 1994. That's at this point a whopping 32 years ago. Adjusted for inflation, that looks like it would come out to about $872 in 2026 dollars. Adjusting for inflation, the original PlayStation would be roughly the equivalent of $654 today in 2026. So effectively, Nintendo 64 couldn't offer anywhere near the storage capacity people suddenly wanted or needed, and Sega Saturn couldn't compete with the price of the original PlayStation. So, okay, bottom line. This isn't about dunking on Sony or criticizing PlayStation. I don't think I really have been criticizing either PlayStation or Sony. Okay, yeah, I did have a few little nitpicks about the controller specifically, but in general, that's not what I've been doing here. I'm all for giving due credits, and Sony's due credit for their tremendous success with the PlayStation. It's just I don't like people being given undue credit. So I don't like pretending that because the PlayStation was a huge success, that it must have done all these amazing, wonderful things, praise be to Sony, because that just plain isn't true. So for the Sony fans that I may have possibly offended, if I've offended you by saying any of these things, I apologize for that, as that was not my intention. I was just trying to be realistic and objective. But I guess if it makes you feel any better, feel free to roast me in the comments. But I do thank you for watching, and have a blessed rest of your day.
Ancient trees, shadows stretch when no one sees, a whisper of fate in the autumn breeze, the path ahead.